Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone to this live stream. Today we'll be talking about basically the conversations that we don't have in the Uyghur community. And with me today is Dr. Mastura Alim. If you could just please just give a short introduction to yourself.
Sure, no worries. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. As I was introduced, my name is Mastura. I am living in Adelaide in South Australia, and I am working as a psychologist here. So I'm quite new to the profession, but prior to that, I was doing some research work at uni. Yeah. Is there anything else I should mention?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, actually, because I also
Mhm.
don't know this. What did you like have a specialty in what you studied or anything like that?
So I guess two things. So one area is sort of the research that I did as part of my PhD. So interestingly, I of course did that within our own Uyghur community. So I have an interest in studying how people deal with systemic injustice, where things don't have a simple solution, and people are experiencing that ongoing trauma. And then in my clinical work, I do work a lot with individuals and families who have come from refugee and migrant backgrounds, who are, who do have experiences of trauma and who have a lot of difficulties in the resettlement process in the Australian context.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a very big project, actually. And you did this for your PhD, which is
Yeah,
impressive.
thank you.
Yeah,
It was done with a lot of community support.
I bet. I mean, we do like to support yeah, we do like to support our people in the Uyghur community. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Uyghur Abdullah. I'm from Uyghur Wellness Initiative. I am a Tur Directori. I forgot how to say it in English for a moment there. Project manager, that's what it is, for Uyghur Wellness Initiative. And yeah, today today, like I said, the topic is going to be about the conversations that we don't have. But like the idea for this topic came up from basically from the last talk that I had with Noor and Masume, where they talked a lot about sort of what mental health and wellness is, what therapy is, and how that can help people. And so I guess my first sort of question here would be, uh, how can like the therapy, how can all this mental health, wellness, therapy, psychology, psychiatry, how can that help us, the Uyghur community in specific, do you think?
Um, I think those first two discussions you had with Dr. Mehmetim and also with Noraid and Dr. Masame, I think they did a really good job in laying that groundwork and explaining why, I guess, psychology and what we know from psychology can be helpful, and why engaging in that individual therapy can also be really helpful. And I like to think of it um, sort of in a way that, like, us as Uyghurs living outside of Vatan, like, we have this big thing right around us where our homeland is not safe, our families are experiencing all sorts of human rights abuses. There is the trauma of being, I guess, separated. Like, many of us had to leave, and living in this, different context, while some of us had the blessing of coming young, or we were born here, so we maybe didn't go through those struggles that the initial Uyghurs that resettled did. So there's a broader picture of all of those things going on, right? And they can be really big and really heavy and have huge impacts on our life. But I think we are also human. We have a lot of shared human experiences with other migrant communities and also the communities that we're living in here. And those are sort of like the everyday life stresses, if that makes sense. So, we're still working, studying, raising families, um, doing all the typical stuff that you do as part of, living as a human being. And so we also experience those stresses, those everyday life stresses, right? So you might be having a hard time at work, something's going wrong at uni, I don't know, your kids have got issues at school, whatever it is, right? So it becomes really hard to deal with these everyday issues because we don't just have this. we have another context around us, right? And then
Right.
also beyond that, we have the context of like what's happening around the world, and we also get affected by that. Uh,
That's oh,
yeah.
no, I was just gonna say that's that is it's very interesting that you say that because like as soon as you mentioned like oh there's this big thing that's happening to all of us and then we have to do like our everyday stresses that actually
Mm,
reminds me of a moment that I had when I first moved to America because I don't know if you remember. Quick context: we have known each other since we were children, so
yeah.
yeah. But I don't know if you remember, but I moved to America in 2008, I believe it was,
Yeah. I
and
remember.
I think it was literally a day afterwards. It was like the day after we arrived in America. The July 5 happened,
Mm,
and so there was me, there was my mom. It was just us two because we came first, and then there was a whole thing that, yeah, it was the whole thing.
mhm. Yeah.
We came staggered. Me and my mom, we were there. Uh, we were getting used to just like being in a completely different country. Thankfully, we both spoke English, so that wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
But we were
Yeah.
getting used to like, okay, new time zone. Everyone's driving on the wrong side of
Mm,
the road.
yeah.
People talk funny here. And then July 5, which is happens and it's like, oh, big thing. And then
Mm.
so that was like hitting us as a community. And then at the same time, I believe Michael Jackson died.
Oh wow. I don't remember that.
So
Yeah.
because I do remember that because everyone in
Mm,
America was talking about that on the news instead of like while we were like about oh July 5 a lot of Uyghur people died and it's like
yeah.
I, f- I don't know, like the first moments in America, I felt like I was living in three different worlds at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think that's such a strange thing to experience, right? But I think it's a really common experience for Uyghurs, right? That all of this is going on, and you're feeling it in your body, it's on your mind, and then you go out into the world and you know, have to function as per normal, you know, for lack of a better way to put it. And that cognitive, I don't know if we can call it cognitive dissonance, but it's very, very real. Like there's this separation that happens, right? Because a part of you has to function
Mhm.
and act like, yeah, nothing's going on. And a part of you is like, why are we all existing when like the world is on fire? Like,
Yeah,
so yeah.
yeah. I feel like that's a very common experience for Uyghur people because like
Mhm.
something's happened. Like I think the biggest thing that I've personally felt is that like just sort of like as if my problems don't really exist
Mhm.
because no one
Yeah.
knows about them. No one knows what Uyghur people are, or at least when I was younger. I think a lot more people know who Uyghur people are and stuff like that now.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
growing up, it was more like no one knows what an Uyghur person is. I say, "Hey, I'm Uyghur. Do you mean you're Chinese?" No, no, please don't say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
It's like,
I think that's yeah, that's still a very common experience even now. And I think that's probably one of the biggest struggles that we had growing up here was the
mm,
explanation of who you are, where you come from,
mm,
and trying to do that without, you know, someone's just asked you as part of polite conversation, and then it's like, do I give them the rundown, simplified version that is not accurate, or then do I launch into the 5 to 10 minute explanation of like, you know, how our political history, the occupation, what's going on, where we are on the map, you know, how we're different, what language do we speak? No, it's not Turkish, like, you know, all of that.
yeah,
And you're right, people do know a bit more now. And I think interestingly, in Adelaide, people know us from our food because we have many Uyghur restaurants here. So
yeah,
oftentimes I'll start with the have you had Uyghur food? And usually people are like, yeah, yeah, I like this restaurant.
yeah. No, I will say I do think I think to this day I think the best Uyghur food from restaurants that I've had is actually in Hulja. I did go there once when I was like 7, so yeah, that's probably the best. But second best is Adelaide.
Can't
Second
beat
best
it.
is Adelaide.
Yeah.
But just sort of more on like sort of speaking about like the sort of the stress and all that sort of
Mm,
cognitive dissonance, I guess. like that we
mm,
have to go through as growing up as Uyghur in like Chetel.
mm,
Yeah, I don't know how to say that in English, but
mm,
I, I think one of the things that I've noticed, at least, as growing up as an Uyghur child on the
mm,
outside, was that I think I felt like I was living a very different experience from my parents,
mm,
and from my grandparents as well. And I think when we like experience being Uyghur from as I can speak for like as a child that grew up like a second generation, first generation. I'm not sure how the generations work there, but
mm.
like as the first generation that grew up from parents that like came
Yeah.
from, yeah, grow up
Mm,
speaking both English and Uyghurcha. I think
mhm,
our experience of being Uyghur and sort of the things that we had to go through being Uyghur were kind of different from our parents, because
yeah.
what I see in a lot of them is a lot of loss, I think. Like
Mhm,
there's this idea, of at least in the older generations, of wanting to go back to something,
mm,
and like the way that they talk about Veten and like what they miss and things like that are
mm,
things that, quite frankly, sometimes I just can't relate to it because
yeah.
I didn't experience things like that. Whereas the younger generation, it's more like, okay, you just don't feel like, I feel like we as the younger generation are like, okay, we don't feel like we're in either place. Whereas the older generation's like, no, we have a place and we know where it is and we want it back.
Mm, mm. I think that's very much what I have also heard growing up. But I think there are some of us who straddle both. Yeah. And so, for context, I came to Australia when I was a small child.
Right.
And I
Actually,
had the
after that.
blessing of, yeah, I had the blessing of going back 2 times. So once again as a child and once as a teenager.
Mm.
And how do I put it? I can relate to those feelings of that's where I really belong. Like those are my roots. Those are my people. That's where I came from. Um, and I remember the thing that struck me as a 15-year-old in Vedan, and oh, you're going to know the Australian context here, and it's probably a similar context in the US where growing up with the racism that exists here, the Islamophobia that exists here, and always having to be a little bit more cautious because we are visibly Muslim. So having that, right, and also having experienced a lot of that, I guess the stereotypes where people think they look at you and they think you probably don't know what they're going to talk about, or that you don't speak English somehow, and all of those preconceived notions that you experience. So when I went back as a 15-year-old, I remember feeling so at home because everyone looked like me in a way. No one was looking at me and going, "Oh, she's an odd one here. Like, where did she come from?" And back then, my Urocha, I would say, was a lot better. So, there was no difficulty of communication, of language. Everyone, you know, to the extent that we could practice our religion, was practicing the food. Like everything. I just felt so at home and so at peace. And I was like, this is what it feels like to live in your own homeland, where you're not questioning your identity. You're not trying to like work extra hard to fit in. You're not trying to prove yourself constantly. I was just an Uyghur girl just existing, enjoying what the kids were enjoying. And that was um, something that sticks with me even now. And then I can also relate to the experience of living here. I did all my schooling here. And so obviously, like, I didn't experience those challenges with language that many Uyghurs do experience till now, and that understanding the Australian culture and knowing how to navigate the systems and knowing how to advocate for yourself, all of those things our parents, our grandparents didn't have,
Mm.
and even now are struggling with. And so it becomes really hard to feel like you're at home, and this is where I belong when there's such an obvious barrier, right? So sorry, I'm getting a bit carried away here, but I think, yeah,
No, it's
there
all
are
good.
there are people in our community who have that experience of I don't belong here. I want to find a way back home. And then there are perhaps the generation that born and raised here or came here very early on that feel like Australia is home, and that they fit in here, and they've established themselves, they've established their lives. Um, but I think the shared common ground is that obviously we're Uyghur, regardless of where you live, where you're born and raised. Ultimately, our identity is Uyghur. You cannot suddenly change the way that you look, right?
Right.
And I think that's something that my parents have always said to us is that no matter how long you live here and no matter how well you speak their language and know their customs, ultimately at the end of the day, you're Uyghur, you know? And I think that can be a point of tension sometimes.
Yeah.
Like you say, not being able to, oh, I'm fully this or I'm fully that. And I think being able to be in the middle is really beautiful to me, taking the best of both worlds and taking the blessings that we have, living in the context that we do and the opportunities that we have, and using that to, I guess, to be the voice for our people,
Right.
and to be the voice, for the Uyghurs living outside of Vatan who don't have all the means and all the abilities to voice their
Right.
concerns and get their needs met. So we're in a very unique and fortunate situation rather than, and I want to flip that
Right.
narrative that but it's so difficult because we're this, child of a migrant family, blah blah blah. We don't belong here. We don't belong here. It's so hard, and it is
Right.
not to invalidate that. It's really hard. I know. I've grown up in that, but I think we can change that narrative a little bit and look at how blessed and fortunate we have been in so many ways.
I think it's very interesting that you frame that as like changing the narrative because I think that's also kind of what's helped me kind of navigate that in between space.
Mm.
It's not so much that anything has changed, so much as what
Mhm.
I've told myself
Yeah.
has changed.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I don't know, is that a sort of therapy or is that like something?
It is in itself, right? It is very much in itself a way to cope better, a way to live our lives more meaningfully, is to reframe the way we look at things. And this is something you hear in everyday talk is like shift your perspective or change the way you look at things. And that has really, huge benefits. And I think can create meaningful change in our lives when instead of looking at something as a challenge, as a barrier, as a hardship, to be able to look at it as an opportunity, as a means to do something differently. So it's not always easy. I don't want to oversimplify things. It's not always easy, but that is definitely a tool that we use. We call it cognitive reframing, and it's part of our therapy.
Okay, so if you are having trouble with that, please go to therapy. That's how we can
Yeah,
help
and
with that.
I think, that first question you asked me, I'm not sure that I quite answered it in that, like, while we know therapy is useful, while we know there is a lot of mental health support out there, like, how can we benefit? And I think going back to that kind of like the individual and then the larger context and then the world context, I
Right,
think while we may not have the ability to change the bigger context, we may not be able to change the situation of that then overnight and, all of that. Um, I think getting mental health support, going to therapy can still be really helpful because, like you said earlier, it's so hard to be doing your everyday life stuff if you've got all of this going on.
yeah,
And it can be a
yeah,
place for you to express that because the thing about, I guess, us and our Uyghur families, we don't always have the capacity to be able to express, sorry, our own struggles and our own grief. Because if I'm grieving and if I'm struggling and I'm having such a hard time and you're also having a really hard time, you would think that the two of us we could empathize and relate and be there for each other, but ends up
right.
being really difficult because you are having a hard time seeing beyond your pain and I'm
Mhm.
having a hard time seeing beyond mine. So we come together instead of like supporting each other, we actually may have a lot more friction and a lot more irritability, and invalidation from each other. So I
Right.
think that therapy context can still be super, excuse me, super helpful
Mhm.
because we have a space that we can safely put that out there, and that other person that we're talking to, the therapist, we assume that they're not also going through their own thing, and they're able to be there
Right.
for us. But they're also able to help us kind of navigate reducing the everyday life stress, and that can then have like, it can have rippling effect. Then we're able to, maybe do the advocacy activism work that we want to do. We are able to do, have capacity for other things when we're able to address some of those everyday life stuff. And that can just be relationship problems, it can be work study problems, health issues, a lot of things.
Yeah. No, I totally relate to the idea that, like, even though we're both going through something, like
Mm.
as a family,
Yeah.
sometimes that just makes it more difficult to talk about things. Because I think
Yeah.
a lot of I guess I'm just going to talk about myself more now. I feel a lot of the times when I try to like bring up a lot of things with my parents, like some of the stuff that
Mm.
I was going through, it almost felt like I wasn't allowed to suffer because
Mm.
I have family suffering and going through things so much worse than what I am. Like I'm worrying about a test. Why should I be worried about this? And like I think personally, I do think there is a healthy way to express that, to be like,
Yeah.
hey, what I'm going through in the big scheme of things isn't that big a deal. I can get through this.
Mm. Mm.
It's just at the moment it's very difficult. But it can also be taken as sometimes it could be taken as like when you're already in a bad place, that message just sounds like, hey, your problems don't matter actually, because other people are suffering worse.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
such a, unfortunately, such a common reasoning or common thing that we hear, in our communities, where and there's always going to be, I think there's always going to be somebody who has it worse. There's always going to be a context that's more difficult, and we can use that, like you said, to be more appreciative and grateful for the blessings and things that we have. But at the same time, and in that example, it probably wasn't very helpful for you to hear that. You needed to hear, perhaps, without going into therapy in this discussion, that, yeah, sitting a test is really hard. It's such a universal experience for all of us, right? Like any exam, any test. Um, and I think that goes back to sort of what I was saying, is that our capacity to do the parenting, to do the financial stuff, it becomes reduced because we're so overstretched with this other stuff that's going on in our lives. Um, and that feels worse and it's bigger. So our tolerance for the everyday life stress and everyday life problems that we're bound to experience is reduced.
Right. I think, yeah, no, that definitely feels true for some reason.
Mm.
It's weird to sort of like picture it this way, but like sometimes I feel like you have only so much stress that you can take. And it doesn't matter
Mhm.
what kind of stress it is or where it's coming from. Once you
Mhm.
reach a point, it's just that's it. I can't take anything else and I have to do something to get rid of it. And it's
Yeah.
like, it doesn't matter if it's like from something tiny, like, oh, I don't know, someone's chewing too loudly and that's really annoying me right now. And then that just
Mm.
builds up stress.
Yeah.
But like, it's the same sort of thing as if, I don't know, like I don't want to say it's the same as like experiencing oppression on a systemic
Mm.
level,
Mm.
but it can feel like that sometimes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and yeah, like we all have a certain limit before we then tip over into, you know, burnout sometimes. Like you said, like you reach a capacity, and then when it is gone beyond this capacity, then you cannot tolerate anything, and like really simple tasks become so hard to do. And I think this is something that I saw a lot when I was doing my research, and interviewing, within our community. And it didn't matter if they were older adults, younger adults, um, that people really struggling to do everyday life stuff because constantly we are, it might not be on mainstream news, but we are also actively looking to see where the news is coming from. Searching online for what we can, looking at people who maybe have a little bit of information trickling in, um, so we're constantly in that headspace. We're constantly thinking about it. You might be cooking, but your mind is somewhere else. And so people were reporting that everything was really hard. I had some interviewees who were university students, and they were constantly either feeling unable to cope with the workload, needing extensions, needing to defer their studies because of a very real thing that was happening, and that was making it so hard to do something that they were, without that, they were more than capable. They got there, they studied hard.
Right.
And the same thing with parents. I found that a lot of mums were saying that they are lashing out at their kids, they're getting frustrated with their husband or partner, like it was showing up in those ways. Yeah.
Right. I think sort of going back to like the sort of the topic at hand, which is
Mhm.
the conversations that we don't have.
Yeah.
Um, and like kind of relating to what you actually said just there for a minute, I think there is at least this sort of feeling that there's a tension between different groups of Uyghurs, like most notably between like the younger and older generations, like the Uyghurs that came here before and sort of established their lives in
Yeah.
Çetel'de, and then the
Mhm.
ones that grew up here. There seems to
Mhm.
be like a very steep sort of divide between their perspectives and like the way that they deal with things. And
Mhm.
but it seems like from what you're telling me, there isn't actually much difference in like the problems that they have.
Um, I think so. I think maybe obviously people have their own experiences, and maybe some people would disagree with me, but I think while there are the differences, I suppose, in the ways that we have lived, where our attachments are, in terms of homeland, um, we still have the common experience, like I was saying, that everyone has. You have everyday life stress. And I think there is still a lot of common ground. Um, Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So we're talking about the differences, I suppose, between the older generation, younger generation. Okay, so this is something that we were kind of having a discussion about before this event, about
Right.
setting the context of why there might be those differences. And so I'm going to keep referring back to these circles, these invisible circles here.
Yeah.
um, I think it's really important to understand that at each of those layers, our experiences have been different. So while at the individual layer, like maybe my experience has been like focusing on study, raising kids, that's been my focus. And then on the outer layer, like I may have those experiences of like the times that I went back to Vatan, the relatives that I miss, the memories that I have, wondering if those things are actually they still exist or not, like those places are still there or not, and how my cousins might be, like their life might be, and then the broader context of the world. Seeing the conflict that's everywhere, constantly looking at what's happening in Palestine. It's all I see on my social media, and of course, all those layers are going to affect me, right? And when one of those situations is worse, seemingly it's going to have flow-on effects to the other experiences that I'm having, right? Um, so, for example, seeing the news, the social media, the videos about Palestinian mothers and what they're doing for their children, how they are, surviving, that affects my parenting, right? That affects the way that I look at my children and then think about what I'm doing. And then that takes me to, what about my cousin who's only a few years younger than me, and she has a son who is the same age as mine, and she's been sentenced to 15 years. She's going to come out and he's going to be a grown adult. So all of those things are constantly going on inside of us. It's hard to see outside. Um, and so I think at those different layers, we have different experiences. So maybe you or the next person can't relate to some of those things, but you have your own experiences within those circles, you know.
Right. Right.
Um, so on the one hand, yes, there are differences between those of us who migrated when we were already adults, when we already had established our lives back home in Vietnam, and those of us who came as children, and those that were born here who maybe have never gone back to Vietnam, never seen, you know, these places that their parents and grandparents talk about so fondly. So it makes it hard to relate to each other's experiences sometimes.
Right.
But yeah, but the common ground that I was kind of talking about earlier, that regardless of what our experiences have been, it's really hard to deny that that's where we originally came from. And so all of those things happening while maybe the rest of the world can turn a blind eye, it's really hard for us to turn a blind eye to it. It's really
Mm.
hard for us to ignore it, even if we're not actively out there protesting and doing social media activism. It's it affects us
No.
on so many levels, and so I think that's where the shared common ground is. But I think we maybe have a really hard time in acknowledging that, like between parent and child or grandparent and grandchildren, like we carry what
Right.
they come with, but it looks very different at face value.
That no, yeah, because it feels like when we talk about the same place and the same problems, we just have a different sort of touchstone for it, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
Because like for them, it's always like going back and like guilt for leaving people there. Whereas for us,
Mhm.
it's like it's more, I don't know, that's where we're from, but it feels a little more distant than that. Because
Yeah.
like I when we talk about we're Uyghur and this is like our culture and everything like that, I
Hmm.
think the only reason that we do feel such a strong attachment to it is because that's something that our parents taught us.
Yeah.
Like, because when we talk about culture and language and all that, there are Uyghur people like out here, Cheta, that didn't grow up Uyghur.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
didn't like their parents didn't teach them the language.
Hmm.
They grew up completely. I think the word we'd use would be assimilated into the outside culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes, yeah, they do come back and be like, yeah, they try to find that root connection that their parents had to something before and be like, yes,
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
Uyghur, I'm going to learn the culture, I'm going to learn the language and
Mhm.
everything like that. But
Mhm.
for us, it's more like this is something that our parents gave us that
Yeah.
we kind of carry now, like whether
Yes.
we like it or not, because we
Yeah.
grew up like this.
Yeah. They're the link. Yes.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
like, it's something that we experienced through them.
Hmm.
And I don't know. I feel like for some people it feels more like a weight than it does a responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely see that. But I just thought that as you were describing, Uyghurs who've born and raised somewhere else and have assimilated to the culture that they were raised in, it's interesting that they come back as adults and try to find some roots and connections. I think that strikes me because our identity is ever changing, right? And I think when we're older, when we become adults, we can have an appreciation for something that as children we didn't really understand. We didn't really appreciate. What's the big deal? Why do we always have to go to Uyghur on Sunday? Why are we
Uh,
always being told off? Oh my gosh,
yeah.
only being told to like play with your Uyghur friends, don't have these friends, and all of these things.
Play with your friends.
Yeah,
Most of them are your cousins, but play with them.
yeah. um, sorry, Will. The question you were asking me. Sorry, what was it again?
I think I've completely forgotten as well. We're just sort of talking about like our experiences now.
Okay. Um, Yeah, so I think you mentioned like that weight and responsibility, right? Because we've been given
Yeah.
that, right? That's
Mhm.
where the link is. Our parents, grandparents, aunties, and uncles who are here, they provide that link to connection with, Vatan, our homeland, our people. without that, we probably would have also assimilated. We probably, you know, um, would have
We
lost a
would have been
lot.
completely different people.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. It'd be so different. And I think that's where some of that oh, I've lost my train of thought again. Where some of that kind of tension and resentment can kind of um, develop, I suppose, because if we think about all of the things that um, the elders in our community and the people that are even, here now, have given up and sacrificed in order to be here. And ultimately, why did they do that? Ultimately, why did they leave? Um, if it weren't for, a better life for their children, security, safety to practice religion, all of those things. So they left for very, very big reasons, gave up a lot, lost a lot on the way. And so they then come to this new place. They have worked really hard to establish themselves, provide financially for their families, raising their kids, trying to give them the best possible education. That's what I see here. That's what I'm speaking to is this, the Australian context.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's relevant across the board. And so then children, they grow up and they have their own identities and their own independence, and they don't have those shared experiences of struggle and sacrifice as their parents did. Sorry if you hear my children in the background. They're just
That's
waking up.
fine. It's
Um,
all good.
so, so they don't have those experiences of the sacrifice and of the migration. Um, but they kind of carry some of that responsibility in that the parents kind of, I guess, have an expectation, understandably, that you've now got to use this opportunity. You've got to study your best. You've got to do things a certain way. You have to, keep the language alive. You have to stay within the culture in terms of marriage, like all of those factors, right? And
Yeah.
these things become hard because, and I'm not sure that I have an answer for this. I'm sure people have,
Right.
maybe better place to speak about this, but it's really a common challenge that's occurring within our community here. Um, in that I've done all of this stuff. Like, why is my child not going to uni? Why are they not excelling in their studies? Why have they married outside of the culture? Why are they not speaking the language? Like, and it doesn't help that like they're experiencing all of this and then they're getting judgment from other people in the community too. And it's
Yeah.
it's until you go through that experience yourself, you don't really know.
Right.
It's not the fault of one person that this happened, and it's not a problem to be diagnosed either, if that makes sense. It's
Yeah.
not like, I think there needs to be more understanding on both sides for the younger generation
That's
to understand this is where my parents are coming from. This is why it's so important. This is why it's such a big deal. And to understand that there are very long reaching future implications for the decisions that we're taking. So, on the one hand, yes, there is a big weight in the responsibility and the life choices we make. But on the other hand, we're so privileged to be able to make these life choices, right? So privileged, so blessed.
yeah.
And
No.
then for the older generations to understand that our children have grown up away from all of this. So yes, they're having a hard time relating. They don't know. They've never seen these relatives. Might talk about them in theory, but they've never met them. They didn't form a bond and a connection and a relationship. They don't have stories to tell about their aunties, uncles, cousins, whatever. And so I think there can be more understanding on both sides,
Yeah.
and a bit more acceptance as well. Understanding and acceptance that some of these things are bound to happen, as it happens for many, migrant communities growing up, living outside of their homeland, um, and a bit more of a wider kind of lens at looking at it and thinking like it's not a oh, how do I say this? Like, it's not a guaranteed bad outcome, you know, if your child chooses this but not that.
Right.
There are ways that we can still kind of keep the culture, the identity alive. There are still ways that we can keep the fight against injustice alive. And I think there is a real fear that our children are growing up are going to completely lose their Uyghur identity, you know? So
Right.
I think both sides, valid points,
Yeah.
and there should definitely be more conversation, open conversation, and more understanding.
I think yeah, no, that's a very I think it's a very interesting point that you bring up about just sort of that fear of losing Uyghur identity, which
Mhm.
is I feel that quite a lot because my name is Uyghur. I was named Uyghur so I don't lose my Uyghur identity.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but it's also as someone who did like was born outside and grew up outside, I think
Mhm,
a lot of my like sort of cultural Uyghur touchstones, they come from my parents and grandparents, but they
mhm,
are also old touchstones. I think the biggest way that I can like sort of say that is that the way I speak Uyghurcha, 총라는
mhm,
Uyghurchilarek, men mawo yaşlardek yapqılmayman. Mawo vatenden chiqqanlardek gap qilmayman. Ular xitoycha bilan alishib ba'zida gap qildi-ku ular.
mhm.
Yoki ba'zi narsani boshqacha deydi. Masalan, like if I want to say something is like really good, I'd say yomon yaxshi or something like that, or
Yeah,
dehshat yaxshi right?
yeah.
But like I think I heard someone. This might be actually a regional thing because I think they were from Urumqi. They said that like, well, like, they like this really food set yash kurdike, and I was like, I've never heard
Uh,
anyone say that before. And it's like,
yeah.
yeah. And so I think it ends up being like as we grow up and like we experience this Uyghur culture through our parents, we end up sort of like through no just because of where we live and like the cultural
Mhm,
context that we're in, we end up
mhm.
kind of changing that Uyghur culture to fit with us. And
Yep,
while that's happening, the culture back in Beten is also changing. And it's
yep.
also not the same as like how our parents remember it.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so I feel like so that sense of like losing something that they had, I both on two ends, from both in Beten and like over here where it's like, oh, this bala uh like mandaka they're too Western now.
Yeah. Mm.
And the people back in Weten, they're too Sinified, they're too Chinese now. And it's like I
Oh,
get that it feels like they're losing something that they held very preciously once. They're
yes.
losing like there's
Yes.
no place for them in the world anymore. And I
Yeah.
think once I understood that, it became a lot easier to be like, okay, I see where you're coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It becomes easier to empathize, right?
Yeah. It
Um,
becomes easy. Yeah, when you think of it like that, and it's like,
yeah.
and that's the whole thing about the whole the narratives you tell yourself, the way you see the world,
Mm,
perspective changing. And I
yeah.
think that's not something that I was able to do by myself. I had to talk to a lot of people to be able to understand
Mm,
that. I had to talk to
yeah.
my parents a lot. I had to talk to not even just my parents, just like other Uyghur people from Veten, for example. Because I think because I think they also feel a little bit the same when they meet us, the children that grew up outside. They're like, "Oh, you're Uyghur. You're kind of old, but you're also very different. You're also very Western." And it's like,
Mm, that's right. You know,
yeah,
we're bound to be influenced by the context that we live in, and culture is ever changing. You know, and what you're describing probably is, um, a description of the grief and loss that the older generations do experience, because the Vatan they remember, it's not the same. It's not the same. You know, and what we can see of, the social media that kind of does reach us from Vatan is their lifestyles have become so similar to ours as well now. Um, and you know, there's just so much change in both contexts. Um, and not to disregard, obviously, while in Vatan there's these change of context and change of culture, they're still living under very much daily oppression, which again influences a lot of things on what they are able to express, what they are able to practice, what they are able to keep of the Uyghur identity, of the Muslim identity. So it's I think it's challenging. Um,
well,
yeah.
that's also a thing that I think is a little. I don't know how to explain it, strange to me
Mm,
because growing up, I mean, we grew up in like the same community. So growing up, I
mm,
always thought Uyghur, Muslim, very interlinked, very like they're the same thing
mm,
basically to me.
yeah,
But like as I grew up, I met Uyghur people who are not Muslim sometimes, who are like
mm,
who are Christian, who have different faiths, and it's like, that is also there are Uyghurs like that back in Veten too. And so
mhm,
I don't know, when I think about like what my parents think of or what my parents and grandparents think of like the Uyghur community and how things are, it really is just sort of like the community that they grew up in.
yeah,
Because my parents, both from Volja, they could talk about Volja all the time, but I don't really know what it was like to be like, I don't know, like a Kazakh person living in Volja, because they would always
mm,
talk about like the Uzbeks and Kazakhs in Volja that also speak Uygurcha and everything like that. I don't
mm.
know what it would be like. Like, is the Ghoja that they experience the same Ghoja as those Kazakh people? Is it the same Ghoja that like Uyghur Christians experience?
Mm.
Is it even similar to
Yeah.
like Khotan already, or a different place, a different city?
Um, I think if we think about just general like human experience, it's different. It's different for you. For me, we can grow up in the same neighborhood and the same street. Our experiences are different. You know, there are shared
Right.
experiences, there's shared common ground. We can reminisce about certain things because, hey, do you remember, the playground that was around the corner from your house and we'd go there all the time? Do you remember the hours we would sit with the Power Ranger videos and just play them? Shared experience, shared memories, and we can reminisce. But
I actually forgot about the playground. You're so right. I forgot about that playground.
um, your perspective, your experience, your perception of that same event is going to be very different from mine. There's going to be shared common ground, but ultimately, it's not the same. Is what I'm trying to say. It's not identical. Just because we were in the same situation at the same time. It's like if you've got 3 or 4 kids in a family, they've got the same parents, right?
Yeah.
But their experiences of their parenting or their experiences and perceptions of their parents wildly different. That can
Yeah.
happen. So.
No, I definitely feel that growing up as a twin. I do think that my parents did kind of treat us a little differently.
Hmm. So yeah, I think that speaks to that difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no. So that was most of like what I had, but
Mhm.
I think so we just sort of talked a lot about like our experience and things like that.
Mhm.
I do kind of want to talk, just sort of circle back a little bit to like therapy and like mental health and wellness and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, so we do talk about there being these issues that we have in our community, like with communication, I think is sort of one that we've diagnosed throughout this conversation. Like
Yeah.
the communication between generations, I guess, and
Mhm.
like the sort of different perspectives we have, just trying to be able to like understand one another and sort of the stress that that causes between us. I think
Mhm.
another thing that we don't talk about, not just between generations, but I think between just Uyghur communities in general, is sort of like the stress of not, well, two things I'd say. It's like the stress, like you said, like that big outer stress of being Uyghur under everything that we're doing, but also the stress of not being understood because we aren't communicating properly.
Mhm.
Like, and also like that sort of, and this is something that we kind of touched on just a little bit, was
Yeah.
that sense of judgment in the Uyghur communities, because I think that is also a very real thing. I don't even think it's just like the older generation. I think it's all of us. We all do this thing where we like judge other Uyghur people for for not doing something like a certain way, for not being Uyghur enough sometimes, I
Mhm.
think, or like not being Uyghur in the right way,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I said I was going to turn this back to therapy somehow. I don't know how that is going to. Well, actually, you tell me, do you think that's something that we can like that therapy can help with, or is it something that we have to just like deal with?
I think therapy can be helpful at the individual level, right? So
Right.
going back to when we talked about everyday life stuff, and making it easier for us to cope and making it, I guess, giving us the skills to deal with all of these things that are happening. Because, sometimes in life you might be just barely surviving, sometimes in life you might have things together. And I think that's a shared human experience. So I think therapy, individual therapy, can help at that level. I think, and therapy doesn't only just happen at the individual level. I think maybe that's how we've conceptualized and been talking about it. But therapy can also happen at a community level, and sort of at a group kind of level. So, and it doesn't look like your typical therapy where you're sitting with one person and having that conversation about what's going on for you, what are the problems that you're having. Um, and so, at a community level, I think we very much can have programs, have discussions, have groups where we talk openly about these things. And we get people's, perspectives and experiences, and we get people's insights and ideas about what they're really needing, how this issue that they're experiencing can be resolved, how we can have greater empathy, how we can have more meaningful social connections. Because I think this is something that has been very noticeable in our Uyghur community over the last couple of years, is that this further distancing between, you know, and within our community. Um, and I think we were talking about earlier before this discussion about how the Uyghur experience in Turkey and the Uyghurs in Australia and the Uyghurs in the US, we're all, have
Right.
experienced different experiences because of the context we're living in. But I think in each of those Uyghur communities, you can see that there may be um, a separation within that community. And maybe it comes from, part of that comes from the grief and loss that they're experiencing. Part of it comes from like this judgment that's going on, and part of it comes from like our reduced ability to have empathy and make time for these connections because of everything we're carrying. So it's kind of become sidelined, like, coming together as a community. So I think there needs to be a lot more intentional effort to bring people together.
Mm.
And we come together, like, it's not like we don't, we're not living in isolation. We still come together, we celebrate, we grieve. But I think for these specific things that we've talked about and these specific challenges that the young people are having or the older adults are having and the older generations are having, like, they need a space to express that. They need a space
Right.
to feel heard, and you don't have to come up with solutions. You don't have to have answers. I think it can be healing in itself to have a space where we can talk about these things, be open and vulnerable, not feel judged, you know?
Right.
I think so. Those of us who are in this field, who are doing this kind of work, are well placed to do that. Getting the education and willingness out there before we do that um,
Right.
is is something, that may be hard, but also that may be very. We may find that people are very willing to do this.
I I do think that, at least from the people that I've spoken to, like that, I think Uyghur people, we do want that community is the thing. And I think
Mm,
we do want to like sort of build that together. But
hmm
like you said, it's just like that fear of judgment, and the judgment in and of itself is quite, I don't know, it seems to run quite deep in the Uyghur community, where like if someone does something wrong, like you hear about it so quickly.
Yeah.
Like even in, like I've lived in both in America and in Australia. And in Australia, in Adelaide at least, I feel that we have a very tight-knit community. Everyone is always in everyone's business. You know what's happening with
hmm
someone so and so's family all
Yep.
the time.
Yep.
But even here in the US, I don't think everyone is everyone in everyone's business like that here in the US. There's still like quite some distance between people. And yet you still hear those sorts of stories about people. Like you always hear about so and so's cousin did this thing, or so and so's brother did this, and blah 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 blah, and there's this happening, and there's that happening. And it's like it almost feels like we've taught each other how to judge people
Yeah.
very, very easily. It's like
hmm
as it's almost like like that's the coping mechanism that the Uyghur community has. It's like we, in order to be able to like feel good about ourselves, we judge other Uyghur people and just tear each
Yeah,
other down a bit like
yeah.
that.
And I think, it might not even just to feel good about ourselves, but it might just be to not kind of reflect on our own situation, or to not kind of introspect. It becomes a way, because you don't want to look at, people have a hard time looking at their own pain and looking at their own challenges and looking at what's not going well for them. So it's easier to look at others, right? And then that's where judgment comes from. And I think it's a human thing, but I think within the Uyghur community, I I would love to see us move away from that. I would love to see us come back to, and I think something that's we sometimes lose sight of is what our values are and what our objectives are, and our cause is as Uyghurs. We can get very easily like divided because of a political difference, or I thought, I believe X about this person, but you believe Y. So how can we possibly work together now? We believe two different things, and we lose sight of the greater purpose, the greater cause, which is, the freedom of our people, which is the freedom of our land, which, when we are able to open our scope and our lens wider, we're able to see this thing as being this size. It's not huge. We can overcome this. We can still, you and I can still collaborate, and we can work together, and we can be a community. But when we're not thinking about our bigger cause, and we are looking at this tiny problem here, but now like it feels like this, it's taken up all our time, space, and energy. I feel like this, without sounding, again, going into a completely just different discussion, I think this also becomes a tool for the enemy. I feel
Right.
like I'm going to start sounding like the mullah over here, but I think it's like a divide and conquer kind of situation where, like, if you're so busy and if you're so focused on all these small things that are happening here, and we're so busy judging each other for how we dressed and whose wedding, what happened here, like, we're so consumed with that, our time and energy is going to that.
Mhm.
It's so hard to come together for meaningful
Yeah.
things, for bigger things.
Yeah.
And when I think the older generations have played a very important role in establishing the community, but I think they continue to carry the role of demonstrating to the younger people, the younger generations that are growing up and seeing this, that, despite our differences, we can always come back together as the Uyghur community. We can always come back together of a shared cause, of a shared purpose. We're all doing things in a slightly different way, but all for the same reason. Because if that doesn't get
Right.
demonstrated, without sounding very negative,
Mhm.
I don't think the younger Uyghur people are going to be able to come together so closely
Mm.
if, this separation and differences and all of that is happening within families and within community. And now we don't speak to this person, and now we don't attend this person's events.
Right.
So, yeah. And look, not to say that the younger generations aren't doing great stuff. Like, there's heaps happening. I think you just only have to look to see all the great initiatives that are coming out, what the youth are doing, how active they're being. And I think as a bit more of an acknowledgement and appreciation from the older generation and the community would help to motivate these young people to carry on this work, because they are
Right.
doing it, you know. We're all
I
working in shape or form towards it.
I do want to sort of speak on that a little bit. I feel like we have been sort of edifying the older community a little bit.
Mm.
I do want to say they do have their problems as well. I have my beef with some older people as well. And specifically, again, I think I keep coming back to this, but from the judgment, I do think that a lot of younger Uyghurs feel like, again, that they're not Uyghur enough because of the judgment of the way that they speak Uyghurcha, because it's not as
Yeah.
good as the older people would like it,
Yes.
because, and I think, and again, this is something that I don't think we talk about, but I think we should. There is a little bit of thing among the older community where they're a bit what's the word? Territorial is not the right word, but it's like oh, I'm from Roja and you're from Kashgar. Oh, wait, we can never get along. That kind of thing,
Yeah,
which is a bit,
it's a bit unfortunate.
it's a bit weird. It's a bit weird.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. But I mean, that's not to say, again, like, that's not to say that they don't, like, I think the older generations have done a lot of good for our community.
Yeah, yeah,
There's also some things that I think we don't need to learn from them, like that sort of, I don't even know what to call that, that kind of discrimination against
yeah.
cities, regions.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure either, but you're definitely right. There is, and that's another issue that I feel like, oh, I know we're running out of time, but another issue that I have witnessed within our community here is that the disregard for the people who have laid the foundations, who've done all the really hard work to establish our community to the extent that it is now. We are, literally riding on the shoulders of these great people who've done this work, and we're able to do what we're doing now because of that. So we definitely should not disregard that. We should, I think, remind ourselves of it, have an appreciation for it, um, to help us in the work that we're doing as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's, yeah, I think it's definitely something that we should remember that we're not here. We didn't come.
From
Sorry,
now,
I've been in America, and so the first thing that came to my head was you didn't fall out of the coconut tree, which is
never heard of
Kamala
that.
Harris thing. Yeah, that's
Oh, no.
it. Basically, you didn't just appear out of nowhere. We
Yes.
are we are here because of the people that came here before us, because of our parents, because of our grandparents, and because of the things that they passed on.
Yeah.
That said, we don't need to do everything the same as they did. And I think there is good that we can learn from them, but also I think there's some good that they can learn from us too, a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty much the time that we have. It was really nice to talk to you, actually. It was very, yeah,
Thank you.
had a very
Likewise.
good time. But yeah, I would definitely love to, if you can, like, come again, I'd love to have you again. Is there anything else, just like some closing remarks or anything that you'd like to give?
Um, I guess maybe it's like the key takeaway that I would like, those of our community who are listening, is that they can be more open, and empath- empathic communication,
Yeah,
within our own community, within our own people, so that we can come, I guess, together. We can be stronger together rather than, and there's an Uyghur saying for this, it slips my mind, but like, you as an individual trying to do this work by yourself, it's going to be so hard. It's so much easier
yeah,
if we come together. It's so much easier if we could come together on common ground. We're always going to have shared common ground in our Uyghur identity. So I think that's something we should, remind ourselves of.
yeah. No, I think that's a very beautiful sentiment to end this all on. So come together as a community, whether you be Kashkala Khokhotenlik, it's fine. We're all Uyghur.
That's
All
right.
right. Thank you so much for being here with me here
No
today,
worries.
and we'll see you all next time.
Sure. All
Machlam
right. Thank
Sechosh.
you.